Right, so with the unfortunate news that Laura Kuenssberg was back presenting her own show this morning, expectation was things would return to Sunday morning normal, with the establishment being well looked after once again. And indeed it looked very much like that today, with her guests including Lord, whoops, I've lost my phone, how careless of me, all that COVID inquiry data that might have been in Bethell, and the eternally odious and perennially wrong Piers Morgan, a man you don't talk to about phones either. Standard balance, you might be thinking. Usually the pretence of a left voice goes to Labour or some such thing at this point, laughably. But instead, Green Party Co-leader Carla Denyer was on the panel, and if you wanted some actual balance, she was more than up to providing it, pushing the Green Party's pro-ceasefire narrative with regard to the situation in Israel and Gaza, and taking Morgan down a peg or two while she was at it. Right, so the situation in the Middle East remains desperate as further bombing continues. Western narratives continue to support Israel, with the already in enough trouble and should keep his nose out of things Boris Johnson now having skipped off to Israel himself to press flesh with the Israeli Defence Force, presumably before they go off and bomb some more civilians who, it seems inescapably clear to those paying attention by now, are either being deliberately targeted or definitely not being exempted from their actual targets. The civilian death toll in 3 weeks is 20 times that seen in Ukraine since the start of the war there with Russia. That's not the actions of a force trying to minimise civilian casualties, nor trying to actually rescue hostages, as they claim. That's the actions of a force that really doesn't seem to care. Piers Morgan has apparently been skipping between the US and the UK this week, both countries very much on the same page regarding Israel, i.e. they're on their side. And this shouldn't surprise many, since the US basically writes our foreign policy, and that we'll do whatever they do, and Starmer's position in opposition is apparently based on exactly the same thing, so nothing would change with him in charge either. When asked about his stateside findings on Laura Kuenssberg's show this morning, though, Morgan said, well, it's an unbelievable mess. It's horrific. What happened on October the 7th was horrific. I think the scale of the response from Israel, clearly on the civilian toll in particular, is horrific as well. And the question becomes, what is the proportionate response? So Israel says that their mission statement is to eradicate Hamas, and we can all understand why they would want to do that. Hamas committed an appalling act of terror on its people. They don't just have a responsibility, a duty to their people to ensure it doesn't happen again. It was only last week that a Hamas spokesman was proudly boasting that they would do it again and again and again. So Israel has to defend itself. But clearly we're looking at these scenes with Gaza, and your heart just despairs for the poor people, the poor innocent Palestinians. But how do you eradicate a terror group, 40,000 of whom are living amongst the civilian population, without massive civilian casualties? Oh, he started out so well. And of course, condemning Hamas as much as Israel for what they've done is absolutely the right position to take. But Morgan's position by the end of what he had said there is nothing that can be done to avoid civilian deaths. No mention of the sort of places Israel has been hitting and killing civilians at, you might notice. Churches, mosques, hospitals. But then Israel's excuse is that Hamas are hiding there as well, whilst also saying they're all in tunnels. So make your minds up. Making excuses for the scale of the civilian deaths, or coming close to it, as I feel Morgan has here, is quite wrong. Somebody who might well know a thing or two about civilian deaths, given his involvement in the Johnson administration's handling of the pandemic, as has been coming out in the mainstream news this week, has been incredibly well covered by them at the expense of matters in the Middle East. It was almost as if they're trying to cover it up a little bit, I feel. Hence my personal reason to not have covered the goings-on with the COVID inquiry at this point. And the fact that this inquiry will rumble on still until 2026 yet, so there's going to be so much of it still to come out. It's going to get silly. But Lord James Bethell said on this story, when it was put to him too, he had to answer a question as well, have a view. When it was put to him, the matter of the US and UK having both prescribed Hamas, what did he make of the call for humanitarian pauses has been coming out? And he decided that Iran needs to have pressure put on them, Iran being the funders of Hamas, it is being alleged, despite the fact there is ample evidence, not least admissions previously from Benjamin Netanyahu himself, that Israel are funding Hamas in order to bring about situations where Israel gets put in a position where they can take over the Gaza Strip, as I believe has always been their intent, reinforced, I feel, by previous and current commentary having come from the now Minister of Intelligence in Israel, Hila Gamliel. Kuenssberg then had to come to Carla Denyer, of course, asking her, could the UK be a broker in bringing down Hamas via Iran, springboarding off what James Bethell had said? And of course, this is how it always goes, isn't it? The narrative gets set up by those pro-establishment figures, the question put to them first, and then the token lefty, for balance, gets a question framed on what had already been said by them. But this is what Carla Denyer had to say. I think the UK historically obviously has a lot of responsibility for the situation we're finding, obviously not solely, but I do think the UK has a responsibility, and we've seen this week that 3/4 of Brits want a ceasefire, and so I don't think they're being represented well by Conservatives and Labour who are refusing to call for a ceasefire. There just isn't a military solution to this crisis. It's horrendous seeing the suffering of civilians, both Israelis and Palestinians. More violence is not going to solve this problem. So the Green Party has been calling for a ceasefire and calling on the UK government to join the growing international voices that are saying a ceasefire and a renewed effort towards a peaceful political solution. Now, neither Morgan or Bethell had been interrupted as they spoke, but of course Carla Denyer wouldn't be treated with that same respect. And in came Morgan with both feet, saying to her, "What about Hamas? That's the real question. It's all very well calling for a ceasefire, and I understand it. Of course we want to stop so many innocent people being killed in Gaza. But if you have a ceasefire, what you're really saying is we're going to leave Hamas in power, and they themselves have been oppressing their people. So I think it's much more complex than to be saying, hey, so let's stop Israel doing what it's doing. We can all share a concern about the scale of it. But a ceasefire means Hamas stays in power." Now, I thought your heart was despairing at all the civilian deaths you were seeing, Piers. Now they're a price worth paying because of Hamas. That's Israel's line. Denyer didn't let it go, though. She said, "So it is very complex, you're right, but we have to get to a peaceful solution. That's what everyone wants in the end, right? And we have to look at how we're going to get there. And although the thought of negotiating with people who don't share our values and who are prepared to make terrorist acts..." Well, again, she got cut off by Motormouth Morgan chipping in. Victoria Derbyshire would never have let this carry on. Kuenssberg is the host here, in case you'd forgotten by this point. But Morgan again came back in with, "You can't negotiate with Hamas because Hamas's stated objective is to eradicate Israel." This time Denyer wasn't going to let Morgan have it all his way, though, and she chipped back in. She cut him off. Delightful to see. But she came back with, "But if you look at what happened in apartheid South Africa, in Northern Ireland, in the end it comes down to negotiation. So the question is, how do we get there in as short a possible time with the least possible deaths?" Whoops! Common sense came in. Morgan's excuses got rumbled. Kuenssberg suddenly must have had somebody blasting in her ear, screaming, "Stop her now before she says any more!" So she snaps out of her daydream or whatever she was doing while she let Morgan just carry on running her show for her and put the brakes on. And so, on to the next question. It's the closest I've seen a UK political party leader stand up and infer what Israel is doing is apartheid, by bringing up South Africa, and by also bringing up Northern Ireland, and by inference the IRA. Thus it is demonstrated that proscribed terrorist organisations can and will engage in diplomacy and peace talks to bring an end to violence, which of course is what everybody wants. Jeremy Corbyn has long been ridiculed for his unfortunate reference to his friends in Hamas, but it is because he was engaging in peace talks with them at the table, as they had to be, that he referred to them as such. It was diplomacy. Same when he was involved at the request of then Labour Northern Ireland Secretary Mo Mowlam in talks with the IRA. Stuff like that got weaponised against the guy, but he was right. And historically, when ceasefires have been called, Hamas have respected them. Israeli documentation has borne that out, even if their leaders and representatives have lied through their teeth about that since, to suit their own ends. Morgan is wrong. What's new? Kuenssberg saved his backside, though, because Denyer's point was irrefutable. The Green Party were the first UK party to call for a ceasefire. Most won't know that because Green Party stuff rarely ever makes the news. But they are absolutely right that a ceasefire should be called, and they're sticking to their guns about it, excuse the pun. It needs to stop being blocked by the US, dictating foreign policy to everyone else in the West, it seems. They wouldn't be dictating that to a Green administration, though. All the deaths happening are avoidable if we can get people around the table for talks as fast as possible, if that's what the world really wants. And I have to question some world leaders as to whether that really is what they want. A ceasefire is the very first step. Talks on neutral soil would be next. It's not going to be easy. It's complex. Morgan and Denyer both said that. Both are right. Hamas did commit a terrorist attack, yet Israel have killed so many more innocent people. Hand back those surviving hostages. That also goes for the hostages Israel have taken from the West Bank that nobody is talking about. The West Bank being hammered by settler aggression right now, as well as Israeli attacks despite Hamas not being there at all. That's a disgrace. This is a 75-year mess in the making. The Zionist movement that dominates Israeli politics needs to be held accountable to international law finally, and the way to peace begins to take shape. It worked in South Africa with BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. Yet, of course, the Tories are trying to outlaw that when it comes to Israel. Starmer would back that move as well. Neither main party is capable of making the right calls for the UK on this, or capable of holding Israel to account for what it has been doing, of representing the interests of the majority of British people who want a ceasefire. So if this matters to you, if this is a voting red line for you, then back the Green Party. There will be a lot more reasons to do so as well as we get closer to the general election and their manifesto comes out. Though, of course, you can visit their website now and see all of their policies listed, because they only get changed when we Green members vote to change them, because policy is shaped by us. There's a path to peace here, though. Let's get back to the main point in question of this video. But for us to play our part, we need to stop voting for parties that simply won't back it. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do also have your say on this video in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where protesting for peace in Israel and Palestine on Armistice Day is being decried as bad taste. But sadly only by people who don't know the meaning of the word armistice, literally the dictionary definition of it. But I'll help them out here in this video, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.